On March 22, 2020, in the Wanangata Valley Wilderness, a remote valley in the Victorian Alps, Southeast Australia, a man named Richard Hill was checking the bushland when he saw something strange. A grey Toyota pickup truck parked silently in the grass, near the Dry River Track campsite. The vehicle was intact, the doors were unlocked. A camping blanket was still spread out behind it. In the camper kitchen, the kettle was still slightly warm. Folding chairs were set up, the teapot was half empty, everything seemed to have been recently used. But no one was there. Richard waited for several hours. No one returned. He called the police. The car was identified as belonging to Russell Hill, 74, who was traveling with Carol Clay, 73, a longtime girlfriend of his. Both were from Drouin, Victoria, nature lovers, familiar with the wilderness, and had been camping regularly for decades. There was no sign of violence, no blood, nothing stolen, but they had disappeared, not a footprint, not a note, not a note. Within days, the disappearance had become headline news in Australia. ABC, 7 News and the Herald Sun all reported, 2 elderly people disappear in the bush, no one knows what happened. It was not the first time someone had gone missing in Wanangata, an isolated, rugged area with a history of violence, crime and local legend, but Russell and Carol were no amateur adventurers. They knew every bend, every hilltop. If there was an accident, they would report it. If there was a problem, they had communication equipment. But all communication stopped on the night of March 20th. Then a chilling revelation emerged. Russell's transmitter had been left with its batteries removed and placed outside the tent. No accident, no straying, someone, or they, had deliberately cut off communications. Police began to fear the worst. A friend of Russell's told the media, "I know Russ. If he's not communicating, something's wrong. And I'm afraid it's beyond saving." Russell Hill, born in 1946, was a radio technician and veteran of the Victorian Emergency Communications System. After retiring, he lived a quiet life at his home in Drouin, a small town in the Gippsland Hills. Russell was calm, precise, and extremely fond of the forest. During his decades of work, he spent most of his free time camping, fishing, pitching tents, and exploring the Alpine Highlands. Friends often said, "Russ knows the Victorian forest like the back of his hand." If anyone could live a month out there without a telephone, it would be him. Carol Clay, born in 1947, was an active social worker and a former president of the Victorian Women's Council. Unlike Russell, who was quiet and reserved, Carol was charming, well-educated, and always made a good impression in any meeting, but few people know that they were in love. Since 1960, Russell and Carol knew each other since high school. They loved each other, but then because of circumstances, because of family, because of society, they broke up. Each person started their own family, had children, had grandchildren, lived 2 parallel lives for more than 40 years, but in 2006, when both were separated or had lost their spouses, they met again. No noise, no publicity, just camping trips, sometimes with friends, sometimes alone, but actually together. They didn't need anyone to know. No need to confirm. Just a few days in the woods, by the campfire, with a kettle of tea, was enough. Their relatives later confirmed, they were together like an unspoken agreement, not to destroy anyone's world, but also not to live without each other. In mid-March 2020, Russell invited Carol to go camping in the Wanangata Valley, a place he had been to dozens of times. It was a wild, almost isolated area, accessible only by 4WD or hiking. No phone reception. No permanent ranger station. They both knew that, and loved the silence. Russell brought along a radio, a GPS, and the HF transmitter he had been using for decades. They planned to camp at Dry River Track for a few nights, then return before the end of March. The trip started like any other: 2 old men, an old Toyota, a teapot, a gas stove, folding chairs, a small guitar, and the woods. They set up camp on the afternoon of March 20th. That night, Russell even broadcast an HF signal to his radio crew. Everything seemed normal. On the morning of March 21st, no one heard his voice anymore. On the morning of March 22nd, the car was abandoned. The camp was deserted. The two of them, gone, a love that lasted 60 years, a trip like any other, but this time, they never returned. Wanangata Valley is one of the most remote regions in Victoria, Australia, a vast valley deep in the Victorian Alps, surrounded by dense forest, rocky mountains, and cold streams all year round. The area is hours away from major roads and can only be accessed by off-road vehicle, horseback, or on foot. For nature enthusiasts, especially former foresters, hunters, and wilderness enthusiasts, Wanangata is a sanctuary. Russell Hill has camped here at least 20 times in his life, mostly in places deep in the forest, with no phone signal and no one around. For him, the further away from people, the closer to nature. Russell and Carol set out from Drouin on March 19, 2020. They stopped in a few small towns, bought food, petrol, and checked their radio equipment. On the evening of March 20th, at around 1803, Russell sent an HF radio signal to his friends in the contact group, saying, "Arrived at Dry River Track. Camp OK. No one nearby. Good tea." That was the last communication. On March 22nd, as is well known, Richard Hill, a patrolman, discovered Russell's Toyota Land Cruiser abandoned. The camp was still intact, folding chairs were up, kettle had just been boiled, tent not folded. But Russell and Carol were completely gone, no personal belongings taken, no drag marks, no blood, just an eerie silence. Most unusual, the HF radio had its battery removed and was placed outside the tent. For Russell, a former emergency communications officer, this could not have happened unless forced. He lived on a radio, and there was no way he would accidentally take it out in the middle of the woods, far from anything. The next day, more than 80 kilometers away from the campsite, near Mount Hotham, firefighters found a burnt-out, unmarked, unrecognizable car. After investigating, they confirmed it was Russell Hill's Toyota. Someone had driven the car away from the campsite and set it on fire to cover up any traces. This completely eliminated the possibility of an accident or disorientation. It was deliberate and intended to cover up the crime. Wanangata was no stranger to crime. In 1917, in this very valley, a brutal murder occurred. A man's body was buried in a stable, and his friend disappeared and was never found. To this day, it remains one of the most famous unsolved cases in Australian history, the Wanangata mystery. The disappearance of 2 others in the same area, a century later, sent shivers down the spines of locals. One told the press, "It's a beautiful place, but not a gentle one. Those who enter Wanangata should know, nature doesn't kill. But it doesn't save either." From the moment Richard Hill reported the abandoned campsite, Victoria Police launched a massive search, but despite the involvement of helicopters, dogs and bushrangers, no trace of Russell Hill and Carol Clay was found. No trailing shoe prints. No torn clothing, no scattered belongings, no blood, no bodies. Just emptiness. The burning of the Toyota Land Cruiser at Mount Hotham, 80 kilometers from the campsite, was a key turning point. Police determined the car was set on fire on the night of March 21 or early morning of March 22. The fire was started with petrol poured around the engine compartment and tires. a clear indication of intent to destroy evidence. There was no trace of a body in the car. Shoe prints around the scene were carefully erased with leaves. The question is, who drove the car there? Russell. Impossible, he had lost contact, and no one had seen him after the evening of March 20th. A horrifying theory was forming. The killer had come to the camp, attacked Russell and Carol, then driven their car to Mount Hotham, set the car on fire and either returned or fled in his own vehicle. The detail that most convinced the police of the crime was Russell's HF radio had had its battery removed. This was no accident. For a communications technician like Russell, he would never have removed the battery of a vital device in a place without a signal. Someone had deliberately made it impossible for him to call for help. Then disposed of him and Carol, cleanly, without a trace. The fact that the police had not found any trace of the body, despite searching for hundreds of hours, led to a chilling conclusion: the killer knew the jungle, and knew how to hide the body. Not an amateur, not a madman, but someone with experience in alpine terrain, who knew when, where, and how to move through secondary routes without being tracked. Notably, 20-21 March 2020 coincided with the start of the first phase of the COVID-19 lockdown in Victoria, which caused a significant drop in travel. The perpetrator could have used this time to move unnoticed. Crime technicians noted something unusual: no blood at the camp, no signs of dragging, no tire marks other than the victims. No foreign DNA, but there was also no sign of a voluntary departure, no missing luggage, no maps, no hiking gear. Russell and Carol never intended to leave the camp, unless something forced them to. At that point, a terrifying theory began to circulate: Russell and Carol may have run into another camp nearby, had an argument, bumped into each other, or discovered something they shouldn't have. And they were killed to silence them. The police couldn't prove it, but circumstantial evidence began to pour in, including accounts of an unfamiliar car, an unfamiliar camp, and a lone man seen near Dry River Track the night of the murder. The question was no longer whether there had been a crime, but how the perpetrator had managed to hide it almost perfectly. The police needed a break, and they didn't expect that break to come in the form of a blue car and a dash cam. It's been almost a year since Russell Hill and Carol Clay disappeared without a trace in the Onondaga Valley. The public hasn't forgotten. The family is still posting photos. But Victoria police have run out of leads. Until early 2021, a man accidentally brought something they had been unable to find: dashcam footage. The man, an adventurer, had been driving through the Alpine National Park in mid-March 2020. When he heard about the disappearance, he remembered recording the entire journey on his car's dashcam. He showed the video to the police. They reviewed the hours of footage. Amid the forest and dusty turns, an image emerged that brought the investigation team to their feet. An older model Nissan Patrol, dark blue, turning onto a narrow road near Dry River Track, where Russell and Carol's camp was set up. No license plate. No driver. But no one but Russell had reported a camp nearby. The car appeared around the time Russell sent his last radio signal, and then disappeared. Police began combing through hundreds of blue Nissan Patrols in regional Victoria, focusing on people with a history of hunting, camping alone, or familiarity with alpine terrain. Over the course of several weeks, they narrowed the list down to 5. One of them was Greg Lynn, 55, a veteran Jetstar pilot who lived in Caroline Springs, a suburb of Melbourne. He owned a blue Nissan Patrol that matched the footage. Greg Lynn had no criminal record. No overt suspicious behavior. But when he was first interviewed in mid-2021, he categorically denied being in the Onondaga area. The problem was, the digital evidence said otherwise. While Lynn was being followed, police secretly collected a DNA sample from a can he had thrown into a public bin. When they compared it to a trace sample left on a burning object at Mount Hotham, the results shocked the entire investigation team. The DNA matched, not enough to convict, but enough to take things further. In November 2021, police searched Greg Lynn's home. There, they found a small, dried blood stain on the floor of the trunk of his Nissan Patrol, an unregistered .22 caliber shotgun, a .308 bolt-action pistol, a weapon capable of causing fatal injuries at close range, consistent with the murder theory. All of this was enough to warrant Greg Lynn's arrest on 2 charges: the premeditated murder of Russell Hill and Carol Clay. When questioned by investigators, Lynn did not deny his presence at Wanangata. But he gave a convoluted story. "I was camping near them. We had a little argument. A gun went off when Russell threatened me. I didn't mean to kill. Then Carol saw it. I was scared. I didn't know what to do." Lynn admitted to hiding the bodies, driving them to Mount Hotham and burning them to avoid being traced. He claimed to have buried them deeper in the alpine forest, but couldn't remember exactly where. Was that not intentional? Believable? The police didn't think so. The case had gone from a disappearance, with no blood, to a deliberate double murder, and the accused was a respected pilot. Husband, father, and now the suspect in the murder of 2 elderly people in the middle of the woods. Greg Lynn, 55, was a commercial pilot with more than 30 years of experience. On paper, he was a model, worked at Jetstar, flying domestic flights, married to a teacher, with grown children, lived in Caroline Springs, a quiet suburb west of Melbourne, no criminal record. Neighbors described him as polite and quiet. No one would have imagined that the man wearing a pilot's helmet, smiling in the cockpit, would be the one who shot 2 elderly people dead in the middle of the woods, set fire to his car, disposed of the bodies, and then went to work as if nothing had happened. When he was arrested in November 2021, Lynn initially kept quiet. But after days of questioning and under the pressure of evidence, he said, "I was camping near their camp. We had a disagreement about the radio volume and the location of the camp. Russell threatened me with a gun. During the struggle, the gun went off. He died. Carol panicked. I lost control." This was the only explanation he gave for the 2 deaths, the burned car, and the disposal of the body. Police were strongly suspicious. There was no trace of Russell carrying a gun on that trip. There were no witnesses to the struggle. And if it was an accident, why not call an ambulance, but hide the body, burn the car, cut off communications, and cover up the entire scene for 2 years? The prosecutor said, "He didn't react out of fear. He reacted like a killer. And he did it very well." Psychologists assigned to evaluate Lynn described no mental illness or emotional disorder, extremely self-controlled, hates being disturbed, easily angered when challenged, extremely methodical crisis management skills, demonstrated by the almost perfect concealment of the crime scene, no blood, no DNA, no witnesses, no negligence until the dashcam accidentally recorded it. He didn't lose control. He was sober. And that's the scary thing. The fact that Greg Lynn was a pilot was not only shocking, but also made the case unacceptable to many people. On social media, posts were filled with questions. How could someone who flew for thousands of hours, carrying the lives of hundreds of people in his hands, be able to kill and then return to work as if nothing had happened? How could the personnel's psychological control system let someone with such dangerous behavior slip through? Jetstar immediately suspended Lynn and refused to comment. His former colleagues were shocked, unable to believe what they were hearing. One said, "I flew with him. He was very professional. Very meticulous. But now I think about it. It was the coldness that gave me the chills. Lynn said he moved the bodies in his car, deep into the Alpine region, and buried them high in the mountains near the Union Spur track, a place so inaccessible that even helicopters would have trouble landing. It took almost a year of searching, with a modified account and GPS data, before Russell and Carol's bodies were found in November 2022, exactly 2 years after they were killed. Both had been buried by hand, covered with branches, rocks, and forest soil. Quietly, but deliberately. In May 2023, after months of preparation and more than 3 years since Russell Hill and Carol Clay went missing, Greg Lynn went on trial in the Supreme Court of Victoria. The courtroom was packed with press, relatives of the victims, and former Wanangata campers, all waiting for one thing, the truth. Greg Lynn was charged with 2 counts, first-degree murder of Russell Hill, first-degree murder of Carol Clay. He also faced additional charges: desecration of a body, destruction of evidence, and tampering with a crime scene. The state prosecutor described the case as a crime not committed in the heat of passion, but in cold, calculated fashion. The perpetrator not only killed, but attempted to make these 2 people into people who never existed. Lynn's defense attorney did not attempt to deny that the 2 men were dead. Instead, they stuck to their narrative: this was not a premeditated murder. It was a tragedy that resulted from a misunderstanding and an accident. My client tried to save the situation in the worst possible way, but that doesn't make him a murderer. The prosecution fired back: there was no evidence of a struggle, no one but Lynn had a weapon, there was no plea for help, no remorse, just burning, hiding, and silence. If it was an accident, he would have had 872 days to talk, Sheriff Lane said. But he chose 872 days to keep quiet. When asked if she wanted to say anything at trial, Lynn said, "I didn't kill them with premeditation. I'm not evil." No apology. No address to the victims' families. No emotion. Carol's daughter burst into tears when she heard it. Russell's wife, Margaret Hill, was stunned. Everyone knew this man had never felt remorse. After 8 days of trial, the jury returned a verdict: first-degree murder, guilty. Both victims, the judge pronounced. Greg Lynn ended 2 lives, without warning, without just cause, and covered up his crimes with a chilling clarity. His actions were not mistakes. They were choices. And the court will respond with justice. Life without parole, convicted at Bar 1 prison, the state's maximum security prison. After the trial, the Hill and Clay families held a small memorial service in Druin, where Russell and Carol had lived. In the golden sunset, relatives gathered around a picture of the 2, with an old guitar and a pot of tea in the middle of the table. No one said much, only the final words from granddaughter Carol, engraved on the memorial: they died together, as they had lived, quietly, simply, and lovingly. The murder of Russell Hill and Carol Clay left more than just 2 graves and a life sentence. It left a hole in the heart of Australia, a country that has long prided itself on its peacefulness, friendliness, and unspoiled nature. No one expected that a former respected pilot could kill someone in such cold blood. No one expected that a familiar camping trip of 2 elderly people, seemingly ordinary, would end in an unwitnessed, unsalvageable death. The Wanangata Valley has been less poetic since the murder. Although it remains open to explorers, the Victorian government has increased security checks at entry points to the bushland, installed vehicle surveillance cameras on dangerous alpine roads, released a new safety guide for seniors and women camping alone or in pairs. The Victorian Emergency Services Department advises, don't just pack a tent, food, and water. Have an emergency plan, and never believe that the bush can happen. Russell and Carol's families don't want their deaths to be lost in the headlines. Instead, They have set up the Quiet Together Foundation, a non-profit organization that supports older people to learn survival skills and light self-defense in the wild, holds regular camping safety workshops for middle-aged couples and single backpackers, works with Monash University to launch research into crime in isolated natural areas, a largely undeveloped area of law in Australia. The foundation's logo is a steaming teapot, next to the words, "They came for peace. Let us protect that peace for others." They came for peace. Let us protect that peace for others.